He thought he had married the perfect woman, but after her death, he found an old briefcase that changed everything. Subscribe to our channel, watch our other videos, and write in the comments where you are watching us from. The day of the funeral passed in a haze that clung to Daniel like a heavy fog. The cemetery was quiet except for the shuffling of feet on the gravel paths and the murmured prayers of the pastor. Winter had stripped the trees bare, and a sharp wind blew across the open ground, tugging at the corners of coats and rattling the wreaths of flowers laid at the foot of the grave. Daniel stood rigid, his dark hands trembling slightly as he gripped the wooden handle of the shovel he had used to toss the final handful of dirt over the coffin. His daughter stood beside him, her small fingers clutching his own, not fully understanding the permanence of what was happening, yet sensing that the world had changed forever. Elizabeth had always been the heart of their home. Her laugh had filled their modest house with warmth, her presence had steadied him through the uncertainties of life, and her quiet faith had given them both a kind of anchor. To see her lowered into the earth, to know she would never again walk across the kitchen floor or bend to kiss their daughter good night, was a weight that seemed to crush Daniel's chest. He felt as though a great silence had opened in the center of his life, one that no voice or prayer could close. After the funeral, friends and neighbors came by the house, bringing casseroles wrapped in foil, pies in cardboard boxes, and words of comfort that floated around him but never seemed to reach his heart. They said the usual things, that Elizabeth had been an angel on earth, that she was now at peace, that time would heal what seemed impossible to endure. Daniel nodded politely, but his mind wandered. He wondered if they really knew her, if they had ever seen the look that sometimes crossed her face when she thought no one was watching, the flicker of something heavy and unspoken. He dismissed it as grief's cruelty, but the thought lingered at the edges of his mind. At night, when the house had emptied and the casseroles cooled untouched on the counter, Daniel sat in the living room with the lamp casting a circle of light around him. The walls seemed to press closer without Elizabeth's laughter to push them back. Her books were still lined up neatly on the shelf, her sweater still hung over the arm of the chair, her scent still clung to the pillows in their bedroom. Everywhere he turned, she was both present and absent, a shadow that both comforted and haunted him. Their daughter, barely old enough to understand what death meant, would ask questions in a small voice as though afraid of the answers. "When is Mommy coming home?" she would whisper, and Daniel's heart broke anew each time. He tried to explain in gentle words that her mother was gone, that she was with God, but the child's eyes would grow wide with confusion. At night, when she finally drifted to sleep, Daniel would stand by her bed and stroke her hair, whispering promises to protect her, though he was no longer sure how strong he could be without Elizabeth by his side. The community saw them as the perfect couple. Elizabeth was known for her kindness, her dedication to church activities, her tireless work at local charities. To everyone else, she was the woman who had come into Daniel's life and completed it, a wife and mother who seemed flawless. They had admired her pale hair, her delicate smile, and the grace with which she carried herself at every event. People often remarked on how well matched they were despite their different backgrounds, how their love had seemed to transcend all barriers. Yet, as the days stretched into weeks after the burial, Daniel felt a growing unease. It was not only the grief that gnawed at him, but a sense of unfinished knowledge. He realized with a quiet jolt that he knew very little about Elizabeth before she had come into his life. She had spoken vaguely of her childhood, never given details, and whenever he asked, she would brush off the question with a smile and a change of subject. He had accepted it then, too in love to press her for answers. Now, alone in the house that carried her absence like a wound, he felt the weight of that mystery pressing harder against him. Nights were the worst. Sleep evaded him, and he would wander from room to room, touching her belongings as though by doing so he could summon her back. He would open drawers and find her neatly folded scarves, her letters from friends that she had never shared, little tokens she had kept hidden away. Each discovery was small, ordinary, yet strangely foreign, as though each object hinted at a life he had not fully known. He began to realize that their marriage, as solid as it had seemed, had shadows in its corners that he had never dared to explore. One evening, after putting his daughter to bed, he stood at the foot of the stairs that led to the attic. He had avoided the attic since her death, telling himself there was no need to disturb the boxes of old things stored up there. Yet now the thought pressed insistently upon him. Elizabeth had spent more time up there than he had realized, sorting through old belongings, sometimes locking herself in for hours. He remembered now how she would come down afterward with reddened eyes, claiming that it was just the dust. He climbed a few steps but stopped midway, overcome by a mix of dread and anticipation. The silence of the house wrapped around him, and he felt as though Elizabeth's presence lingered just beyond reach, urging him forward yet warning him at the same time. He retreated that night, promising himself he would return when his heart was stronger. The days continued to drag, filled with small duties and the constant care of his daughter. Yet, each time he passed the stairway to the attic, his eyes would linger, his thoughts circling back to the unanswered questions. He found himself recalling fragments of conversations with Elizabeth, the way she had once reacted sharply when he asked about her family, the way she had brushed off questions about where she had gone to school. At the time, he had attributed it to pain or estrangement, but now it seemed part of a larger pattern of concealment. The silence after her loss was not only the absence of her voice, it was the silence of secrets left unspoken, of a life lived behind a veil. Daniel began to feel that his grief was entwined with something else, something darker that he could not yet name. He resolved that he would one day climb those attic stairs and face whatever truth Elizabeth had hidden. For now, he sat in the dim glow of the lamp, the night pressing against the windows, and whispered her name into the emptiness, as though hoping it might answer back. The weeks after the funeral passed in a blur of small routines and heavy silences. Daniel cared for his daughter as best as he could, keeping meals on the table, helping with her schoolwork, reading to her at night. Yet, whenever the house fell quiet, his eyes would wander to the ceiling above him, to the narrow pull-down stairs that led up into the attic. He told himself it was foolish to dwell on such things. An attic was only a place for forgotten belongings and dust. But the thought gnawed at him all the same, persistent and unsettling. Elizabeth had spent time there more often than he had realized. Sometimes he would come home from work and hear her footsteps overhead, moving boxes or shifting things. When he asked what she was doing, she always offered vague replies, looking for old books, sorting through memories, nothing of importance. He had believed her. Now, in her absence, every vague reply seemed like a piece of a puzzle he had ignored. It was a Saturday evening when he finally gave in to the pull. His daughter was staying with a neighbor for the night, and the house lay in silence around him. The wind rattled the windows, the floorboards creaked with his every step, and Daniel felt as though the walls themselves were urging him upward. He pulled the cord, and the attic ladder unfolded with a groan. A puff of cold, dry air rushed down, bringing with it the scent of wood and dust. Daniel climbed slowly, his heart beating with a mixture of dread and determination. The attic was dimly lit by a small round window that let in the pale light of a cloudy evening. Dust floated in the air, disturbed by his arrival. He switched on the bare bulb that dangled from a wire above, and the room filled with a yellowish glow that revealed stacks of boxes, old trunks, and forgotten furniture. The sight was ordinary, yet Daniel's chest tightened. He felt as though he had stepped into a space that had belonged more to Elizabeth than to him, a hidden part of her life that she had kept tucked away above their heads all these years. He began moving boxes aside, one by one. Most contained old clothes, children's toys, books they had outgrown. But every now and then he would find something that struck him strangely. A dress he did not remember her wearing, letters addressed to names he did not recognize, trinkets that seemed out of place in their otherwise simple life. He touched each object carefully, as though afraid they might break or vanish at his touch. The silence of the attic weighed heavily on him, broken only by the creak of the floor beneath his feet and the sound of his own breathing. Then, in the far corner, half hidden beneath a collapsed cardboard box, he saw it. A briefcase. It was made of dark leather, scuffed and worn with age, the kind of object that seemed to carry its own history. Dust had settled thick upon it, but beneath the dust he could make out faintly embossed initials. They were not hers. They were not anyone's he knew. His first thought was that perhaps it had belonged to the previous owner of the house, left behind and forgotten. But then the memory struck him. He had once asked Elizabeth about the attic, and she had insisted that everything up there was hers, carried with her from the place to place. If that were true, then this case had belonged to her as well. Daniel knelt before it, staring at the worn leather surface. His hand hovered over the handle, trembling slightly. He could almost imagine Elizabeth's voice behind him, telling him not to open it, not to disturb what was not meant to be seen. Yet the silence pressed him forward. Slowly, with a breath he had not realized he was holding, he pulled it toward him. The case was heavier than he expected. The metal clasps were stiff with age, resisting his first attempt to open them. He pressed harder, and with a reluctant click, one side released. The other followed with a metallic snap that echoed in the confined attic. For a moment, he simply sat there, staring at the closed lid, afraid of what he might find. He knew instinctively that whatever lay inside would change his understanding of Elizabeth forever. When he lifted the lid, a musty smell of old paper and leather filled the air. Inside, beneath a folded layer of fabric, lay a neat stack of documents, photographs, and envelopes. They looked untouched for years, preserved in their secret hiding place. His hand shook as he picked up the first photograph. It was a picture of a young woman, perhaps no more than 16 or 17, standing in front of a white farmhouse. The features were unmistakable. It was Elizabeth. Yet something about her expression, the way she looked off to the side rather than at the camera, suggested she was already planning her escape from that moment. Beneath the photograph lay identification cards, worn with age, each bearing her likeness but with different names. Daniel felt a cold shiver run through him as he flipped through them. Some listed her birthplace as towns he had never heard her mention. Others gave her birth year as 1 or 2 years different than what she had told him. With each card he uncovered, the woman he had loved seemed to slip further from his grasp, her identity dissolving like smoke between his fingers. There were letters, too, their paper yellowed and fragile. He opened one carefully, reading the lupin handwriting. The words spoke of fear, of a desperate need to leave home, of someone named R who had promised to help. The tone was frantic, as though written by someone trapped, clinging to hope. Another letter spoke of betrayal, of anger toward a man who had hurt her. Daniel could hardly reconcile the voice in these letters with the gentle, composed woman he had known. At the bottom of the case, folded carefully, was a newspaper clipping. The headline reported the disappearance of a teenage girl decades ago. Her name was Anna. The photograph printed beside the article froze Daniel's blood. The face was Elizabeth's, unmistakably her, though younger and thinner. According to the article, the girl had vanished one summer evening, leaving behind only confusion and unanswered questions. Daniel sat in stunned silence, the clipping trembling in his hands. His mind raced with questions. Who was Anna? Who was Elizabeth truly? Had she stolen another's life, another's name, to build her own? And if so, what had she been running from all those years ago? The attic seemed suddenly colder, the shadows deeper. Daniel felt a wave of betrayal crash over him. The woman he had buried, the mother of his child, the partner he had trusted, was not who she had claimed to be. The grief that had consumed him was now joined by something else, a gnawing uncertainty that hollowed him out from the inside. He replaced the contents carefully, though his mind was in turmoil. Closing the case did not close the questions it had opened. He knew, with a sinking certainty, that he could not leave it at this. The documents, the photographs, the clipping, they demanded answers. And those answers lay beyond the confines of the attic. Daniel descended the ladder with the briefcase in his hand, each step feeling heavier than the last. The house seemed different now, charged with the presence of secrets too long hidden. He placed the case on the kitchen table and sat before it, staring at it as though it were a living thing. The silence of the house pressed down around him, no longer merely the silence of loss, but of revelations waiting to be unearthed. He thought of Elizabeth's smile, the warmth of her hand in his, the life they had built together. Was all of it a lie? Or had she been two women at once, the woman he had loved and the stranger who had hidden behind a borrowed name? He did not know, but he knew he would have to find out. The night deepened outside, the wind moaned against the windows, and Daniel sat in the glow of the lamp, the briefcase before him, the weight of truth pressing closer. Tomorrow, he decided, he would begin to search. He could not rest until he knew who Elizabeth had really been. The briefcase sat on the kitchen table like an intruder that had no right to be there, its leather surface absorbing the lamplight and giving back nothing but silence. Daniel had not slept at all since carrying it down from the attic. He had tried to rest in his bed, but every time he closed his eyes he saw the face of Elizabeth staring back at him from that old newspaper clipping, younger yet unmistakably hers, a girl named Anna who had disappeared long before he met her. Sleep was impossible. He had returned again and again to the kitchen, pacing the floorboards, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, and staring at the case as though it might speak if he only waited long enough. At last, in the small hours of the morning, he gave up resisting and sat down once more, pulling the contents into the light. His hands shook as he sifted through the papers. The identification cards seemed to mock him with their variety. One listed her as Anna McPherson, born in 1969 in Pennsylvania. Another said she was Elizabeth Green, born 2 years later in Arizona. A third bore the name Margaret Ellis, with yet another date of birth and place. Each bore her photograph, taken at different stages of youth, yet clearly the same woman. The careful styling of her hair and the clothes she wore in each picture gave the impression of someone trying to remake herself again and again, hoping each new name would finally fit. Daniel pressed his fingers to his forehead, trying to reconcile these fragments with the woman he had held in his arms every night. There were photographs, too, some curled with age, their edges yellowed. In one, Elizabeth, or Anna, or Margaret, stood on the porch of a farmhouse, her smile small and uncertain, her eyes directed just off to the side. A man's hand rested on her shoulder, though the man himself was cropped from the frame. In another photograph, she stood beside a woman who resembled her, perhaps a mother or sister, though no names were written on the back. Daniel studied these faces, searching for traces of the family she had never spoken of. He realized with a pang that he had never even met her relatives, nor had she ever volunteered to visit them. He had accepted this as a matter of circumstance, telling himself that some families drift apart. Now it seemed like evidence of something far darker. The letters were the hardest to read. The handwriting varied in mood and pressure, sometimes hurried, sometimes careful, but always filled with a trembling urgency. One letter spoke of fear, of a house where she felt trapped, of a man who watched her every move. Another mentioned someone named R, a figure who seemed both a confidant and a lifeline, promising escape. The words bled with desperation, sentences unfinished, as if she had been writing quickly in secret, afraid of discovery. Daniel's throat tightened as he read them. He could hear Elizabeth's voice in them, though the tone was raw, stripped of the calm gentleness he had known. He placed the letters aside and returned to the newspaper clipping. He read the article again and again, until he could almost recite it by memory. Anna McPherson, age 17, disappeared from her family home in June of 1986. No trace has been found. The article described the search efforts, the pleas of the family, the unanswered questions. Anna had vanished without a word, leaving behind only suspicion and grief. And yet, here she was, transformed into Elizabeth, the woman who had built a new life, a wife and mother who had hidden all of this away. Daniel pushed back his chair and stood, pacing the kitchen floor. His mind was a storm. Part of him wanted to slam the case shut and lock it away to preserve the memory of Elizabeth as it had been. Another part of him burned with the need to know more, to pull apart every scrap of paper until the truth stood bare. He could not live with half answers. He needed to know who his wife truly was, what she had been running from, and whether she had ever truly belonged to him at all. As dawn crept into the sky, the house filled with pale light. His daughter stirred in her bed upstairs, and the sound grounded him momentarily. He thought of her small face, her innocence, her need for a mother she would never see again. What would it mean for her to know that her mother had lived under false names, that she had carried secrets so large they swallowed her past whole? Daniel pressed his hand against the table, steadying himself. He would not burden the child with this yet. But he could not stop himself from pursuing the answers. He returned to the case and began laying the contents out more carefully. He noticed details he had missed before. Dates on the identification cards overlapped in strange ways. One card was issued the same year another identity supposedly existed. The photographs revealed small consistencies, a necklace she wore in each, a scar on her wrist he had never noticed until now. The letters hinted at events, but never clearly. They were like puzzle pieces scattered across decades, daring him to assemble them. As he worked through the papers, he thought back to moments with Elizabeth that now felt charged with new meaning. He remembered how she avoided conversations about her childhood, how she once flinched at the sight of a police car, how she insisted on privacy even with her closest friends. At the time, he had attributed it to a sensitive nature, perhaps a painful family history she did not want to revisit. But what if it had been more? What if she had feared being found, recognized, dragged back into a past she could not escape? The realization hit him with cold clarity. Elizabeth had been living a lie for as long as he had known her. But why? The documents pointed to a girl who had disappeared, a family she had left behind, and, perhaps, something worse, something darker that had driven her to abandon her very name. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, exhaustion and grief pressing down on him. The case had opened more than secrets. It had opened a chasm between the woman he had loved and the stranger he was only now beginning to meet. He felt betrayed, yet at the same time he felt an ache of compassion. Whatever she had endured to force her into such a life must have been terrible. Perhaps she had hidden it not to deceive him, but to protect herself, to protect them both. The hours slipped by unnoticed as Daniel sat among the fragments of his wife's past. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, the occasional creak of the house were the only sounds around him. Outside, the world continued as though nothing had changed, but inside the kitchen the air was thick with revelation. He gathered the papers and photographs back into the case, his hands careful, almost reverent. He closed the clasps, the sound sharp in the stillness. He knew he could not stop here. The briefcase had offered only the first glimpse into a hidden world. If he wanted answers, he would need to follow the trail further. He would need to search archives, speak to people who might have known her under other names, travel if necessary. The thought was daunting, but also inevitable. The silence that had followed Elizabeth's death was now filled with questions that would not rest until he pursued them. As he carried the briefcase back upstairs, Daniel felt both burdened and resolved. The house seemed to shift around him, no longer the simple place it had been, but a stage for secrets waiting to be revealed. He glanced at the attic stairs, then at the rooms that had once felt safe and ordinary. Nothing was ordinary now. Every corner held the possibility of something hidden, something waiting to come to light. That night, when his daughter slept and the house lay quiet again, Daniel sat once more at the kitchen table, staring at the closed briefcase. He could feel the weight of it not only in his hands, but in his heart. The woman he had loved was gone, but the truth of who she had been remained. And he would not rest until he found it. Daniel woke the next morning with the same restless heaviness that had kept him awake through the night. The briefcase had not left the table, and though he had forced himself to close it, he knew that its contents had already spilled into every corner of his thoughts. The images would not fade, the girl in the newspaper clipping, the unfamiliar names printed on worn identification cards, the frightened words of letters written in haste. They haunted him like unfinished sentences, demanding completion. As sunlight broke through the blinds, his decision hardened. He could not sit idle in a house filled with questions. He had to begin searching for the truth that his wife had kept locked away. His first step was tentative. He returned to the briefcase and removed one of the letters, tracing the address written faintly in the corner of the paper. The town was unfamiliar, a place several states away, but the name of the street and the handwriting pressed themselves into his memory. He thought of the library and its archives, the dusty cabinets filled with newspapers and public records. If he could find even one mention of that name, that street, or that missing girl, he might be able to understand. It was not only curiosity that pushed him forward, but a gnawing need. Without answers, he felt he could no longer grieve properly. His wife had left him with a wound, and only the truth could tell him whether it was betrayal or tragedy. At the library, Daniel sat hunched over a roll of microfilm, the machine's hum filling the silence as headlines from decades past flickered before his eyes. He read slowly, careful not to miss a single line. Articles spoke of missing youths, of troubled families, of rumors that never solidified into evidence. His eyes stung as he scrolled hour after hour, until at last a familiar photograph stared back at him. The caption named her Anna, the same as the clipping in the briefcase. The article described a family torn apart, a mother pleading for her daughter's return, a stepfather insisting she had simply run away. The police had searched, but no trace had ever been found. Daniel leaned back in the hard chair, his heart pounding. He whispered her name aloud, and it felt strange on his tongue, as though he were speaking of a stranger who had once shared his home. He copied what he could, filling pages of notes, each word like a shard of glass cutting into the image he had carried of Elizabeth. The librarians cast curious glances at him, but he ignored them. He dug deeper, looking for school records, property deeds, anything that bore her name. He found hints only, fragments of lives she had left behind. Each fragment carried him further from the woman he thought he had known, and closer to a shadowy figure who seemed to vanish and reappear with new names, new faces, new stories. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel's search became an obsession. After work, he would rush to libraries, to courthouse basements, to historical societies. He tracked down census records, family trees, and faded photographs. He drove long miles to towns he had never seen, chasing whispers of the past. The addresses from the letters led him to houses that no longer stood, to neighborhoods that had changed beyond recognition. Yet, occasionally, he found someone who remembered. An old shopkeeper recalled a girl with pale hair who came in for groceries, always nervous, always looking over her shoulder. A former neighbor remembered the mother, weary and quiet, and the stepfather, a man whose reputation carried more menace than respect. The more Daniel heard, the heavier the truth became. It was becoming clear that Elizabeth, once Anna, had not left home merely to reinvent herself, but to flee something darker. The letters had hinted at fear, and now that fear took shape in the stories of those who had known her family. They spoke of arguments, of strange silences, of a girl who seemed desperate to escape. Daniel drove back home after each discovery with the weight of it pressing into his chest, his thoughts circling around the same tormenting question. Had his wife been a victim, or had she crossed a line that could never be undone? One evening, as he sat at the kitchen table with notes spread before him, he remembered her sudden flinches at the sight of authority, the way her eyes would harden when she spoke of forgiveness, though she rarely spoke of her past at all. Perhaps she had wanted to confess, but had not known how. Perhaps she had hoped that silence would bury everything for good. Yet silence had not buried it. It had only postponed its revelation until now, leaving him with a grave full of secrets instead of peace. His daughter noticed the change in him. She asked why he was away so often, why he looked so tired, why he sometimes stared at her with a strange expression. He would smile and stroke her hair, assuring her that everything was fine, though he knew that nothing was fine at all. He could not bring her into this darkness, not yet. She needed her memories of her mother to remain intact, untainted by the shadows of names and lies. So he kept his search hidden, slipping away when she was at school, burying his discoveries in the same briefcase when she was near. Late one night, Daniel returned from another fruitless visit to an archive and sat alone in the kitchen. The briefcase lay open before him, its contents spilling out in a mosaic of false identities and half-truths. He felt the exhaustion deep in his bones, but his mind refused to rest. He thought of how Elizabeth had smiled at him on their wedding day, of the tenderness in her touch when their daughter was born, of the countless small acts of love that had filled their years together. Could those moments be lies? No. He knew they were real. Yet they existed alongside a life he had never been allowed to know. That contradiction threatened to tear him apart. The silence of the house was suffocating. He imagined Elizabeth standing in the doorway, her eyes wide and pleading, as if to say that the past should remain buried. But he could not stop now. The questions had taken root too deeply, their tendrils winding around his every thought. The truth, however painful, was the only path left to him. When he finally closed the briefcase and pushed it aside, the decision was already made. He would not rest until he traced every name, every place, every fragment. The next step would be harder, seeking those who had known her, those who might still remember the girl who had vanished. It meant leaving behind the comfort of home and plunging deeper into uncertainty. But there was no turning back. The silence that had once filled the house had become unbearable, and only the truth could break it. Daniel rose, turned off the lamp, and stood in the darkness of the kitchen. He felt both weary and resolute, haunted yet determined. Tomorrow he would go further. Tomorrow he would step beyond records and archives, into the living memory of those who had known the woman who had once been his wife. Tomorrow he would begin to uncover the hidden life that Elizabeth had carried with her into the grave. The days that followed were consumed by Daniel's growing determination. He could not silence the questions that had taken root in his mind, nor could he ignore the evidence he had already uncovered. Each note, each letter, each photograph pointed to a life his wife had left behind. A world that still existed in fragments if only he were willing to chase them. The documents had provided addresses, names, and towns that had seemed distant and abstract when he first read them. Now they became destinations, places he felt compelled to visit as though the truth itself was pulling him along. He began with the nearest town mentioned in the letters. It was a small place, the kind that barely appeared on maps, and as he drove along its narrow main street he could see how little it had changed in decades. Storefronts looked worn, the paint peeling from their signs, and the diners still had the kind of neon that flickered even in daylight. Daniel stopped at the local historical society, a small building run by volunteers who seemed both surprised and curious to see a stranger arrive with questions about people from so long ago. They led him to dusty files, collections of photographs and handwritten notes, remnants of lives long past. It was there he first heard a story that sent a chill through him. An elderly woman who had grown up in the area remembered the girl in the photograph he showed her. Yes, she said, she knew Anna. A quiet girl, polite, but always with a shadow in her eyes. She remembered how Anna's stepfather would stand with her in the store, never letting her out of sight, how he seemed to watch everyone who came near her. The woman leaned closer to Daniel and whispered that there had been rumors, things nobody ever dared to say out loud at the time, about anger in that household, about nights when shouting could be heard from down the road. Daniel listened with a tightening chest, his hand gripping the photograph. He asked about the disappearance, about what people believed had happened. The woman lowered her gaze and said that after the stepfather's sudden death, Anna vanished. Some said she had run away in fear of being accused. Others whispered that she had a hand in it. Nobody knew for certain. All that was clear was that one day she was there, and the next she was gone, leaving a family shattered and a town filled with unanswered questions. He thanked the woman and left, his thoughts swirling. The pieces were fitting together in a way that both clarified and confused. Elizabeth, his Elizabeth, had once been that frightened girl. She had lived in fear, trapped in a household that seemed more prison than home. If she had fled, it was because she needed to survive. Yet the shadow of suspicion about the stepfather's death hung heavy. Had she escaped an abuser, or had she done something darker? Daniel drove in silence, the road stretching endlessly before him, his mind unable to settle on an answer. In another town, further away, he found an old neighbor who remembered the family more clearly. The neighbor spoke of a mother who was frail, dependent on her second husband, unable to protect her daughter from his temper. He described the girl as strong-willed, with a fire in her eyes, but beaten down by years of control. The stepfather's death, he said, had been called an accident, something about a fall down the stairs, but whispers spread quickly that it was no accident at all. Some believed Anna had pushed him, others said he had been drunk and careless, but when the girl disappeared soon after, those whispers became louder. Daniel left the conversation shaken. He drove for hours, replaying every moment he had shared with Elizabeth. She had been gentle, loving, a devoted wife and mother. Could that same woman have killed a man even in self-defense? He wanted to dismiss it as impossible, but the evidence kept him from resting. She had changed her name, abandoned her past, and built a new life. People did not take such measures unless they had something to hide. Back at home, he sat at the kitchen table, the briefcase open once more before him. He spread out the documents, trying to impose order on the chaos. He arranged the photographs chronologically, lined up the identification cards, laid out the letters by date. The pattern that emerged was one of constant reinvention, of a woman who had erased herself again and again until she became someone entirely new. Each identity lasted only a few years before she shed it like a snake shedding skin. And then, at last, she had become Elizabeth, the woman he met, the woman he loved. He thought of the times she had resisted his family's questions, how she had shied away from gatherings, how she had bristled when his mother pressed her about her past. At the time, he had defended her, thinking it was merely pride or discomfort. Now, he saw it as fear. She had not wanted anyone to look too closely to find the cracks in her carefully constructed story. Late one night, Daniel drove back to one of the towns where she had once lived. He parked near the remains of the farmhouse that had belonged to her family. The building was little more than a skeleton now, the roof sagging, the windows shattered, weeds reclaiming the land. He stood in the silence, imagining a young girl trapped inside those walls, her laughter smothered by fear, her spirit bruised by control. He felt a deep ache, both for the girl she had been and for the woman she had become. He whispered her name, not the one he had known, but the one from long ago, and the sound carried into the night like a prayer. As he turned to leave, he realized something with piercing clarity. Whether Elizabeth had been guilty of her stepfather's death or not, she had been guilty of something else, of silence, of concealment, of never trusting him with the truth. He did not know if he could forgive her, even now. Yet he also knew that her silence had been born from fear, from the desperate need to protect herself. Perhaps she had always planned to tell him and time had simply run out. When he returned home, his daughter was asleep in her bed, the soft sound of her breathing filling the room. He stood watching her, his heart torn between anger and compassion. He wondered what kind of truth she deserved to know, what kind of story he would one day tell her about her mother. He wanted to preserve the image of a loving wife and mother, but he also felt the pull of honesty, of the burden that secrets left behind. He knew that decision would weigh on him for the rest of his life. The hidden life of his wife had unfolded before him in fragments, in whispers from strangers and papers pulled from dusty files. Yet, even with all he had uncovered, gaps remained. There were years unaccounted for, places unexplained, names that led nowhere. Elizabeth had been a master of concealment, and some parts of her story might remain hidden forever. But Daniel also knew he could not stop. The briefcase had opened a door that could not be closed. He would continue to seek, to travel, to ask. Each answer brought new pain, but also a strange kind of clarity. The woman he had loved had been both real and unreal, both present and hidden. To understand her fully, he would have to accept both truths at once. That night, as he lay awake, he thought again of the farmhouse and the girl who had vanished. He realized that the woman he had buried had been carrying not only her own secrets, but also the weight of a past she could never escape. And though she had taken much of it with her to the grave, she had left enough behind to haunt him forever. The farmhouse lingered in Daniel's thoughts long after he had returned home. Its sagging walls and broken windows haunted him like a reflection of the fractured life his wife had carried. He could not erase the image of that girl, Elizabeth, before she became Elizabeth, standing in those rooms with fear pressing against her every breath. And yet, though he could almost feel the weight of her despair, the suspicion that she had played a role in her stepfather's death clung to him with equal force. He found himself walking in circles late into the night, torn between compassion and doubt, trying to reconcile the two faces of the woman he had loved. The house felt different now. Every corner whispered with questions, every object seemed touched by secrets he had only just begun to uncover. When he stepped into their bedroom, the silence was suffocating. The bed was too large without her, the closet too full of things that no longer carried comfort but unease. He found himself staring at her dresses, her shoes, her scarves, wondering if she had stood in front of the mirror and thought about the girl she had once been. Did she hate her reflection, or did she see it as proof of her escape? His daughter, oblivious to the turmoil, continued to move through her days with the innocence of childhood. She asked fewer questions about her mother now, settling instead into a quiet sadness that Daniel recognized but could not soothe. He wanted to give her stability, to build a world where she could grow without the shadows of the past reaching for her. But each time he looked at her, he felt the burden of choice pressing harder. One day she would ask again, and what would he say then? Should he tell her the truth, fractured and incomplete as it was, or preserve the image of her mother as the woman they had known together? The decision gnawed at him, relentless. At night, Daniel spread the documents across the kitchen table once more, though he knew them by heart now. The photographs stared back at him like ghosts. The letters cried out with desperation. The newspaper clipping repeated its bleak message of disappearance. He would sit with them in silence, his fingers tracing the edges of the papers, his mind replaying every moment of his marriage. He remembered her laughter at the simplest jokes, the way she leaned her head against his shoulder during long drives, the care she showed their daughter with every touch. Those memories were undeniable, alive with warmth and truth, but they existed side by side with the lies she had told, and the two realities refused to merge. Sometimes he thought of confronting her even now, speaking aloud to the empty room as though she might answer. "Why didn't you trust me?" he whispered into the dark. "Why didn't you tell me?" His words echoed back to him, hollow, unanswered. He imagined her eyes, calm and steady, looking at him with that inscrutable expression she sometimes wore, the one that now seemed less like mystery and more like concealment. As the days passed, Daniel realized the truth was not only about her past, but also about himself. He was carrying the burden alone, choosing each day whether to share it or hide it. The knowledge weighed on him, shaping his every decision, pulling at him when he tried to focus on work or on caring for his daughter. It was as if he had inherited her silence, carrying forward the very thing she had used to protect herself. In her death, the responsibility had passed to him, and he was left to decide what to do with it. He thought often of forgiveness. Could he forgive her for building a life on lies? Could he forgive her for never trusting him enough to share the truth? He told himself that her secrecy had been born of fear, but the wound of betrayal lingered all the same. He loved her still, that much he knew, but love and trust were not the same. Trust, once broken, left scars that love could not fully heal. One evening, he sat at the kitchen table long after his daughter had gone to bed. The lamp cast its circle of light, and beyond it the room was swallowed in shadow. He stared at the briefcase, its clasps shut, its secrets already known yet no less heavy. The burden was not in the discovery, but in the choice it left him with. To reveal the truth would be to shatter his daughter's memory of her mother, to strip away the image of warmth and love, and replace it with suspicion and fear. To keep the secret would be to carry it alone, to live with the weight of lies for the rest of his life. The dilemma gnawed at him. He imagined the years ahead, his daughter growing, asking questions, seeking to understand the woman who had given her life. He pictured himself hesitating, choosing words carefully, bending truth into something gentler. And he wondered if silence would protect her or simply pass on the same legacy of concealment that had already cost so much. In his darker moments, Daniel thought of the possibility that he would never find the full truth. Too many years had passed. Too many names had been shed like old skins. There were gaps in the story that might never be filled, mysteries that would remain unsolved. Elizabeth had carried them with her to the grave, and he was left with only fragments. Perhaps that was what hurt most, the incompleteness, the sense that he would never truly know the woman he had loved. Yet, even in the midst of his turmoil, Daniel found himself clinging to the good memories. He remembered the way her hand felt in his, the light in her eyes when she looked at their daughter, the laughter they shared in moments too small to record. Those moments were not lies, no matter what her past had been. They were real, and they belonged to him. The burden of truth was heavy, but it did not erase the life they had built together. As he sat in the silence of the house, Daniel came to understand that he could not escape the weight he carried. He could only choose how to bear it. He could let it crush him, or he could accept it as part of the story, part of the complexity of love and loss. The decision about what to tell his daughter would come in time, but for now, he knew only that he had to keep living. The truth was a shadow, but it was not the whole of who Elizabeth had been. When he finally rose from the table and turned off the lamp, the briefcase remained in its place, closed but not forgotten. The burden of truth would follow him into every day that lay ahead. Yet, as he climbed the stairs to check on his sleeping daughter, he felt a fragile sense of resolve. The past was unchangeable, but the future still waited, and he would carry the truth as best he could for both of them. The nights had grown longer, not because of the season, but because of the heaviness Daniel carried with him into every hour. The briefcase had become a constant presence, resting on the kitchen table or tucked beneath his arm as he sifted once more through its contents. Though he knew every document by heart, every faded photograph and trembling line of ink, he returned to them again and again, as if repetition might somehow reveal what was missing. Yet the truth never grew clearer. The burden was not in discovery any longer, but in the choice of what to do with it. He could not carry on in limbo forever. He thought most of his daughter now. Each day she grew a little taller, her questions a little sharper. Though she no longer asked when her mother would return, Daniel could see the curiosity behind her eyes, the need to know more than what he had offered her so far. She clutched photographs of Elizabeth with a child's devotion, asking for stories about how her mother used to laugh, what she liked to cook, the songs she would hum while folding laundry. Daniel answered gently, weaving the truth of memory without touching the shadows that lurked just beyond. Yet every time, he felt the weight pressing down harder. The day would come when she would demand to know not only who her mother had been to them, but who she had been before. One evening, after tucking his daughter into bed, Daniel found himself once more seated before the briefcase. The lamp glowed dimly, the air heavy with silence. He opened it slowly, laid out the contents in careful order, and studied them as though this might be the last time. The photographs, the letters, the clipped article, all stared back at him, whispering of lives she had shed, of names abandoned, of truths never spoken. He picked up the clipping and held it for a long time, staring at the face of Anna, the vanished girl who had once been his wife. For the first time, he realized he was not looking at a stranger, but at the same woman he had kissed goodnight, whose hand he had held through storms and joys alike. The girl who had fled, the woman who had lied, the mother who had loved, they were all the same, bound together by fear and hope, by desperation and tenderness. Daniel leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He saw Elizabeth in fragments, moments strung together like beads on a thread, her smile on their wedding day, trembling yet radiant. The way she had held their daughter for the first time, tears streaming down her face as though she could not believe she had something so pure and new to love. The quiet evenings they had spent on the porch, watching the sun sink low, her head resting against his shoulder. Those moments had not been false. Whatever shadows lived in her past, the love she had given him was real. That truth was enough to steady him. He gathered the documents once more, folding the letters gently, stacking the photographs and placing them back inside. When he reached for the clasps, his hands paused. He understood now that this decision mattered more than anything. To keep the case within reach was to keep tearing open the wound, to let the secrets gnaw at him until nothing remained but suspicion and pain. To hide it away, truly and completely, was to choose what future his daughter would inherit, not one defined by shadows, but by the love her mother had shown while she was alive. With a steady breath, Daniel closed the briefcase and pressed the clasp shut. The metallic clicks echoed in the stillness, final and irrevocable. He rose from the table, carrying the weight of the case in his hands, and climbed the stairs to the attic. The boards creaked beneath his steps, and the air grew cooler as he ascended. The bulb overhead buzzed faintly as he pulled the cord, casting light across the cluttered space. He walked to the far corner where he had first discovered the briefcase hidden beneath boxes and dust. Kneeling, he slid it back into the shadows, covering it with old cloth and placing a trunk before it. It disappeared into the dimness, swallowed once more by silence. Daniel stood for a long moment, his chest heavy but his mind calmer than it had been in weeks. He whispered her name, softly, as though she might hear him from wherever she rested now. Then he turned out the light and descended the stairs, leaving the past behind where it belonged. That night, as he checked on his daughter before bed, he felt something shift inside him. The burden was still there, but it no longer pressed so sharply. He bent to kiss her forehead, watching her stir in her sleep, her small face peaceful in the glow of the nightlight. For her, he realized, he must choose what legacy remained. She deserved a mother remembered for her love, not for the shadows that haunted her. She deserved to grow with the warmth of memory, not the weight of suspicion. Daniel returned to the living room and sat quietly in the darkness. The silence no longer felt suffocating, but solemn, like a space that could be filled with new life. He looked at the photograph of Elizabeth on the mantel, her smile gentle and unguarded. He allowed himself to smile back. He would carry the truth alone, protect the memory for his daughter, and let the past rest in the grave where it belonged. In that choice, he found his peace. The woman he had loved was gone, but she was not erased. She was many things: child, fugitive, wife, mother, but most of all, to him, she had been real. And that was enough. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next shocking story. Click now to watch more unbelievable videos just like this one. And share this video with your friends so they can discover the secret too.